The universe is made of stories, not atoms. So said poet and activist Muriel Rukeyser. And despite the science, despite the particle physics, despite the mathematical equations and the philosophy and the religion and the spirituality, or maybe in spite of all these things, I challenge anyone to prove her wrong. And that's because we can only see the universe from a human perspective, our unique and individual human perspective. And that itself is a story. From our past to our future, to the way we interact with the world, to the way we identify as ourselves, everything about our human experience is made of stories. But all too often, we give up authorship of these stories, our stories, to things outside us. People, circumstances, fears and doubts, cultural norms and expectations, trends, fashions, opinion, and tribes. Rather than becoming the heroes of our stories, we become two-dimensional supporting characters to our past, to our baggage, to other people's stories, and stories of our own creation which don't support or serve us, but instead keep us limited, our worlds small, and our lives out of alignment with who we really are. So what then if we start to become aware of our stories and the impact they have on our reality? What if we start to take ownership of them, rewrite them in a way that serves us much better? And what do we see when we peer beneath them at our storyless selves? This is Conversations on Living, a podcast about how to do well, how to be well, and how to live well. I'm Chris Brock, and together we can be spies in the kitchen of life, going undercover on a secret mission to find out that recipe behind the secret sauce to living a full and happy life. Today I'm speaking with Krish Shrikumar, a games developer and return guest on the podcast. Krish is the brains behind the meditation-based video game Plane and the new game Inward, both of which ask us to slow down, get quiet, and connect to a version of ourselves, a story of ourselves, that is less caught up in the hustle and bustle of modern life, in worries about the future or the past, and instead is more present and able to connect with the benefits that brings. Krish is developing games that build habits which result in positive impacts on our lives. This is a really great conversation that explores how powerful and important stories are in our lives, what it means to take ownership of them, and what lies beneath them. You can find out about Plane and Krish's other work and Inward by visiting plane.co. That's PLAYNE.co. Or you can just Google meditation game. And before we get started, just a quick nod to our friends at Headliner. Headliner is the service that I use to create those audiograms with which I promote the podcast. You've seen them probably for this podcast and others on social media. They're kind of waveforms or graphics and videos with which people promote their podcasts. And Headliner is by far the easiest and most powerful way to create them. So if you host a podcast, definitely worth checking out at www.headliner.app. And if you want to find out more about this podcast, about some of the other episodes, some of the other conversations we've had, you can find it at conversationsonliving.com. And if you sign up to my newsletter there, you can also grab a copy of my latest book, Shine Manifesto. And don't forget, you can carry on the conversation at our Facebook group. Just search for Conversations on Living. And now, without any further ado, it's time to get into this really amazing conversation with the deep thinker, Krish Shrikumar. Krish, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. You were a guest on episode, I think it was 46, and this is going to be episode, I think, 68 or something like that. So it was quite a while ago. But we talked back then about kind of meditation and what happens when you get kind of quiet, you know, what you learn about yourself in those quiet times. And we also talked about your game. So you're a games developer, and you were developing a game called Plane, which is basically a kind of immersive meditation game. And you're working on something new now called Inward, right? So what's that all about?
That's right. Firstly, thanks for having me back on here, Chris. It's great to talk to you again. So it's exactly like you're saying. So I'm a game developer. My last game, which I released last year, was called Plane. It's quite different from the traditional kind of video game in that Plane teaches you and helps you build a habit of mindfulness. And Plane was primarily, it was only developed for the PC. And kind of my ambition was really to bring out a game that would go on mobile, which is where, so I've always known since playing was for PC, I would have to develop a game for mobile. And that's what I'm working on just now. And that's inward. So the kind of goals of the game are similar to playing in that it's created to help people learn how to practice mindfulness. But predominantly its goal is to help people build a daily habit, and kind of to make that commitment of meditating daily a bit easier using kind of game mechanics and game experiences.
Okay, so when you talk about game mechanics, are you talking about kind of the psychology of gaming, or are you talking about the technology of gaming?
Right. So it's basically gameplay. So
Okay.
The great thing about video games and what's amazing about video games, it's very good at habit building. And what I mean by that is it makes you want to come back every day and play. And the way that, traditional games, how it works is it gives you a simple goal that you can practice every day. And as you practice that goal every day, you get rewarded. And with that reward, you can start accomplishing bigger goals. And so taking a game as an example, like there's an RPG game called Skyrim. What you do is you enter the game, you kill monsters. And as you kill monsters, you earn experience. And as you earn experience, you level up your skills and you unlock these special magical powers. And as you unlock these skills, you can kill bigger monsters. And it's like a cycle. So you keep growing. And that sense of growth is really powerful. And it keeps wanting you to go back and play it again. So in some ways, that's what I mean by game mechanics. It's really, it's the fun part of games. And I'm trying to utilize some of that, I guess, in a more mindful, compassionate way that makes the kind of hard work, if you will, of building that commitment of turning up every day and practicing something that's good for your health. In this case, practicing meditation. And it makes that easier. And I think it's relevant because in the kind of times that we live now, when our attention is being pulled from all sides, when we're kind of surrounded by technology, that's really vying for attention. I think we need that, if you like, assistance from technology on the other side to kind of nudge us back towards those things that help us kind of, center ourselves back, focus back into ourselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's quite a powerful thing, I guess, because it's this whole turning up every day, I think, is one of the things that as humans we're quite, without that kind of addictive pull, that kind of instant reward, it's something we're quite bad at doing. So we know exercise is good for us, but it's only when we've been doing it for like a year that we actually start to see the kind of real obvious benefits of it. We know that kind of eating healthy food is good for us, but it's only when you've been eating consistently healthy food for a long time that you see the benefit of doing it. So I can eat a salad today and I can eat a salad tomorrow, but when I don't see that the weight falling off, it's going to be hard for me to kind of encourage myself to eat a salad on the third day and keep doing it for week after week. But games are very good at kind of giving you that quick reward, I guess, and letting you see the benefit.
Exactly. I think what you're saying about I guess in some ways you could say that we have a weakness in that we can attach ourselves to certain things that isn't healthy for us. And that is quite important for us to know that we have this, but instead of calling it weakness, I would just say we have a mechanism as human beings that makes us quite behave in such a way that we get attached to certain things that aren't necessarily that good for us. And at the end of the day, we're living in a world and we're living in a system, if you will, that is vying for that behavior of us that can be in some ways used for us to get hooked on certain things. And the question really is, because even when we think about exercise and when we think about healthy eating, we tend to compartmentalize it quite a bit. Like, we need to now do these 4 things for us to feel healthy again. But in some ways, that's kind of a reaction to the kind of other things that we have got ourselves hooked onto that isn't really our fault, and that isn't really something that we should be blaming ourselves for. And the weird thing that happens is we all blame ourselves for being unhealthy, and we also blame ourselves to and not being able to follow through on building a good habit. But actually at the end of it, you are not in play, you as in the person who you feel is making all these decisions, because at the end of the day, these decisions are being made by your subconscious mind, or whatever you want to call it, that isn't really within your control. And I think I guess the question I'm asking is, and what I'm exploring is, can we use technology to some degree to assist us in building these habits that can take away a lot of this kind of self-judgments that come with living a healthy life, which in a lot of ways is counterproductive. And because at the end of the day, if there's something that's going to encourage you to go out and jog every day, be it an app that gives you little streaks that gets you interested in going out and running every day, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, as long as you see that what you're using is just an assistance at the end of the day. Because even with my games, what I get really excited about is when I hear players in my Discord community who's actually telling me that they've stopped playing the game, but they're continuing the meditation practice, because that's where I would like it to lead to. And that's where I think in a lot of ways, all technologies that assist us will eventually lead us there, or should eventually lead us there, because then it's healthy. Technology should be used in such a way that, here, use me, I'll help you, but I'm just a crutch. You will be walking on your own very soon, and you'll drop me, and I'm perfectly okay with it. Then I think it's fine. I think the issue also comes on the other side, when technology pretends to assist you, but at the end of the day, you have to rely on it all the time. Then it becomes another form of a hook that isn't necessarily, you kind of end up in another cycle of kind of addiction in some ways, if you will.
I mean, I remember in our last conversation, you talked about how the kind of more you became aware of your internal processes, maybe you might call them mechanisms, the more you realized you weren't actually in control of the decisions you were making, and that they were being heavily influenced by your circumstances, by advertising, by media, by just all these little things that even subconsciously push us and pull us in different directions. There's a thing in New York where you have buttons on the pedestrian crossings. But the buttons don't actually do anything, but they make you think that you're in some sort of control. There's that illusion of control.
That's really interesting, right?
Yeah, and this is going on all the time. Our behavior is being kind of channeled in different directions.
Yeah.
And food is being engineered. Fast food, there's no kind of no coincidence that it's highly addictive, and we get hooked because they have teams of food engineers who design this stuff, so it's super tasty, super moreish, and makes you come back for more. And I suppose there's a lot of that kind of stuff that gives us that kind of hit of gratification, and sometimes we can even think that we're doing the right thing, but it's just we're getting into another form of addiction. Just like there are all these meditation apps, but you eventually become hooked on the meditation app itself. And how healthy is that? How healthy are all these guided meditations? Are we really finding out more about us, or are we finding out more about the person guiding us? You know what I mean? Whose kind of roadmap are we following? But what you're trying to do is something a little bit different. You're trying to kind of lead us down the path into the light, emancipate us from these kind of controlling influences. I mean, is that even possible? Is there anywhere else that this is happening kind of in the world?
I'm not sure. I mean, even that whole word, emancipation, is just so powerful, and it's so important. I mean, by no means am I kind of going out there and trying to free people. I don't think about it that way at all. In a lot of ways, I'm still trying to free myself. And playing is really just an expression of, I guess, of that journey to some degree. And I think there's a lot of adjustments that I've made, even from starting, even from starting to build Plane to where it is now, and me working on Inward. There were a lot of assumptions that I'd made about meditation, about mindfulness, and about kind of helping people that were just plain wrong. And I think that's the, I don't like to use the word evolution, but that's the kind of trial and error learning that I'm going through right now. And part of that is certainly what you said earlier in terms of freeing yourself from these, I would say predominantly freeing yourself from that judgment that you have, that really at the end of the day is counterproductive. And also to kind of, to some degree, accepting that even the situation that we are in, as toxic or as unhealthy as it might seem, is also just a part of that growth that humanity is going through. And I think you can see that with the whole mindfulness sphere. I don't really like to comment on it too much, because it's part of that growth. But certainly I feel that, and this is something that's very important for me, which is that I feel that what I'm doing with Plane and Inward shouldn't be about me, and it shouldn't be about my personality, if you will. It shouldn't be an extension of my personality. I mean, it should be as a form of art, as a game, and the story that it expresses. But beyond that, I wouldn't feel comfortable if it was, because I think it all goes back to the kind of meditation that I practice myself. It itself is an evolution, and it itself is a kind of growth of all the different types of practices that I have had. And I think you'll find this with a lot of people, a lot of teachers of mindfulness and meditations, at least the ones that I listen to, and I follow is the wrong word, but I listen to, is that they don't necessarily push you towards their practice. Rather, they would show you what it is, and it's up for you to adjust and grow out of it to some degree. A classic example, I guess, would be a teacher called Ramana Maharshi, who's someone who, I think in the West, he's known for this method called self-inquiry, which is the whole idea of finding out who you are. And you find a lot of people talking about this. It's like, ask yourself the question, who am I? And that's essentially what his entire teaching was based on, this question of who am I? But actually, if you read his teachings, in terms of what he tells you need to do, is very simple. And there's there's a few things that he asks you to do. Like, as an example, one of the things he says is you should try to find out where your thought comes from. And to some degree, just that question is enough to get you going. And you can kind of evolve from there and kind of find your way from there. And I think that's what's really important in terms of, and I don't just mean in terms of mindfulness, I mean in terms of exercise, I mean in terms of even learning things like martial arts. You met a really good teacher if they kind of want you to follow your own gut. They want you to follow your own curiosity, which is extremely important, because whenever someone says, follow my curiosity and you'll be happy, I think you should try and stay away, because then you will always need to follow their curiosity. You'll always need to follow them. To a large degree, I think it's very important. And this isn't just unique to mindfulness. This is unique to everything that we learn. I personally think that you should be guided to follow your own curiosity. And that's very important.
There are a couple of things I wanted to kind of pick up on. One is, you talk about judgment quite a lot, and that's one of the, as kind of, I don't know what it's like in kind of other cultures, but in the West, we're very judgmental. We're very judgmental of ourselves. We're very judgmental of other people. When we say, right, I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. tomorrow and I'm going to go for a run, and you don't, then you're kind of very judgmental in terms of being very critical of yourself. And it's like, well, I'm such a failure for not getting up at 5 a.m. doing the run, whatever it might be. But Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's kind of known as the kind of grandfather of mindfulness in the West, or mindfulness as a kind of clinical technique. His definition of mindfulness includes the phrase non-judgmental. So we need to be where we are in this moment, and we need to be aware of it non-judgmentally. And that kind of leads me into the other part of what you were saying about kind of that whole idea of understand where you're thinking and then look for where it's come from. You can't really do that while you're being judgmental of yourself. But when you stop being judgmental, you can say, okay, I'm feeling terrible, or I failed at this thing I wanted to do. Why is that? Why did I not do that? Or even why, when you start to kind of explore, where is this thought or this feeling coming from? Why do I feel so bad about myself? What are my motivations here? And maybe you can start to unpick those kind of external influences. And this probably ties in a little bit into the whole topic of this podcast was all about stories, the power of stories. This was the idea that you came up with while we were kind of talking before we started recording. But we're surrounded by stories. And, I've often thought that reality happens at the point of perception, which is within our kind of cognitive mind, maybe within our emotional selves as well. That's where we define our reality. And that's where our perspective comes from. And there are always stories going on. And people want to embed their stories in us. We're influenced by the stories of nature. Our identities are attached to stories, self-fulfilling prophecies. I'm a loser, I'm a success, I'm a winner, whatever it might be. I don't have a beach body. I need a new Tesla, whatever it is that's, I must vote Conservative or Labour or Republican or Democrat. Stories all the time. How do we sift through these stories and find out where we are? I mean, is the real us storyless? Is there a kind of a blank kind of version of us beneath the ego, perhaps, that is without stories, and that's the ultimate goal of where we're trying to get? Or is that just even a kind of a farcical idea that might be possible at all?
I love this.
I mean, am I just rambling now? Does any of that make sense?
No. This is something that's very close to my heart. Are we storyless? And I think that is what I'm very curious about. And because this is something I was thinking about, because we'd spoken about stories, and then your mind starts playing games. You're like, okay, so what can I talk about stories? What can I say about stories that's deep and profound? And then actually I realized, well, this is just another story that I am making up in my head. Or I think that's where it's wrong. And we are all guilty of it. I'm guilty of it. I did it right now, which is when we start saying I am. Yeah. Right? It's like I should, I have, I shouldn't. When that I comes in, it's a story. The moment that I comes in, it's a story. And I think what you said earlier about being storyless, this is something that I have been pondering for years, which is the moments when you're entirely storyless, right? And this is going to sound extremely cliched, and I'm sorry in advance, but generally speaking, because it's the same question with mindfulness and meditation and everything, which is, the quiet mind. And it's kind of paradoxical, and I don't like to say it. Even the whole term be non-judgmental, I don't like to say it, because for not just the regular Joe, that's not going to mean much, because the question is going to be, well, how do you do it? It's kind of like, hanging a bunch of money in front of someone, but not showing them how to get it. Right? Yeah. It's just like, here it is. It's like, don't judge, but then without actually saying what it is entirely pointless. And this is why I was kind of wondering, what does it mean to be storyless? And it's going to sound cliched, but the only time that I feel like there's no story is when some of the examples that I have is when I experience something that's really beautiful. And that sounds really, really cringy, but it is what it is. Because at the end of the day, when I see like a really beautiful sunset, when I'm standing in like some cliff face and I'm looking down and I see the ocean and it's just unearthly, there's a moment, and I've only known this afterwards, where you're like, right, something happened there where I wasn't there. And the other point is also when I'm in deep sleep, when I don't dream, like I'm not there. That's entirely storyless. When you meditate, there are points when you're entirely storyless. But it's also just as interesting to see where you are full of story. And it goes beyond you. It's the most absurd thing, because you can essentially transfer yourself so easily to so many different things. When we were kids, we growing up, we would watch cartoons about some dog and or a mouse, and we would transfer our sense of self into this kind of 15 frame animation. And we believe it. We will genuinely believe it. Like the other really absurd thing is, if you watch like boxing, or if you're into UFC, before you watch a fight, your body is getting ready to fight, and you're sitting at home on, I'm on my little mobile screen trying to watch the fight, and I'm just like, why? It's like I'm in there and I'm having the fight. Essentially, you just transfer your sense of self directly onto that other person, which is why it really conflicts with us which is why it's an issue when we have heroes. Because when the heroes start doing something that goes entirely against who you are, then suddenly you have this kind of conflict. I guess another example, more relevant example than a hero, is a guru, or someone who you think is the master. Suddenly, when they start behaving in such a way that goes against who you are and what your story is, that conflict kind of happens. Because what you're doing is you're transferring your sense of self on a regular basis. And we do this daily with people who we meet. Empathy is driven by it. I mean, if you're an empathic person, you're essentially, it's not that I'm feeling your pain. I think it's more that I am you, so I feel your pain. And we're doing this on a regular basis. And I think that makes it this kind of stories that we're constantly transferring back and forth, these characters that we're constantly kind of moving in and out of. It really makes you wonder, if I can so easily move back and forth on a regular basis, I can suffer watching a film. I can be fearful when I watch a film. I can be happy and elated when I watch a film. It's not that I'm sitting here and I'm just watching an actor. You're actually being that person. If it's that simple, then how much of what the suffering that we go through is actually ours? And this isn't in a way to belittle the pain that we're going through, but it's rather, I'm saying the pain you're feeling of someone else is actually just as relevant as the pain that you're feeling for yourself. But at the same time, it makes you wonder how much, which stories actually belong to you. And I don't think any of it does at the end of the day, which is why, coming back to what you're saying about judgment, because for me, it's really important, that word judgment, because that's when judgment it's okay to judge yourself. And it's absolutely fine to be judgmental. It's absolutely fine to wake up in the morning and you can't be arsed going for a run. You're like, oh God, I'm such a failure. That's fine. But at the same time, we should explore, well, that's a story that I'm just attaching myself to. And it's okay. What was that famous thing? I can't remember who said it, but something along the lines of being in pain is one thing and being in suffering is something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, I there was actually a Japanese poet. This is a quote that's attributed to the Buddha, to about a million different other people. But there's a Japanese writer who was also a runner, and he wrote a book called "What I Talk About When I Talk About Running."
That's right. I saw this on your Twitter. Actually,
yeah, that's right.
Murakami.
Yep. Yeah, that's it. Haruki Murakami. I'm probably totally destroying his name, but he said, "Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional."
Exactly.
And it's so true. And I did a two-part podcast a couple of episodes ago with an ultra runner, and these guys, they go out and they'll run 7 marathons in 7 days across the Sahara Desert, and he was, I read about his experience. There was a period where he was probably about 3 days in running his 3rd marathon. In those temperatures, the sand had got into his shoes and it was rubbing the skin off his shoes. He was massively dehydrated. He'd been these kind of gel packs to give them the energy. It's full of like sugar and stuff, but it ruins your stomach. So he was throwing up while he was running through the Sahara Desert, and he was crying at the same time. And that's a kind of different relationship with pain than I have. You know what I mean? For me, that does not sound like something I would ever want to do. But these guys, they have a very different relationship with pain. For them, it's a signal, and yeah, sure, it hurts, but it's not that kind of same kind of like I'm done, I'm a failure. It's just like, okay, it's hurting, but I'm carrying on anyway.
Right.
But they also use mantras. These runners,
Signal.
yeah, it's a signal. And the Stoics would have said, that the suffering is the pain is the path, or the obstacle is the way. When you feel something
Right.
is difficult,
Right.
that's the way you need to go. But these runners also have mantras. They on the gel packs, on the food that they carry, they will write in indelible marker, things like "You're a winner, you can do it, keep going," stuff like that. And again, these are stories that they will repeat. I am a winner. I am. You've got that I am again, and it's that kind of mental story that you tell to keep yourself going.
Yeah. Absolutely, because we're constantly telling, we can get into the cycle of telling ourselves stories that are, because it's all about what you want in life, because we are telling ourselves we are failures is just a story at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Telling ourselves we're not a failure is just a story. At the end of the day, what do you want to believe? Because there is no storyless in between those two, because at the end of the day, you want to go out and run, and you're either going to think you're a failure or you're not. These are just two different stories. And it's really interesting what you were saying about the ultra runner, because it's the idea that it's just a signal, because that's actually itself a story, but that's kind of more believable and more true because it is just a signal. The fact that when you start thinking of all the ways that this can fail because of the signal, then it starts becoming more difficult. And that's all it is at the end of the day. It just becomes more difficult. It can be easier, right? If you just see it as a simple, more positive story.
But what about taking ownership of our stories? What if, because I went through a phase when I was in a pretty dark place, and I became pretty miserable to hang out with. And I remember one night I was down the pub with my wife, and she said, "Oh, every time we come out, I feel like I have to cheer you up." And right. I just remember thinking, "Oh, really?" I don't, because in my head I was just like constantly, day in day out, it's like, you're a loser, you're a failure. Why didn't you study harder at school? Why did you? And going over all these kind of terrible life decisions that I'd made, and all of these kind of negative stories. And then it was coming out into my identity. I was this kind of miserable guy to hang out with, staring into my pint, not much fun to be around. And then she said to me this, and I had this kind of realization: I don't want to be that guy anymore. And so I kind of proactively started to try to change my story. I kind of I went through practices to rewrite the script, if you like. I mean, is it really that simple to change our story and reprogram ourselves? Do you think? Is it? And if it is,
well, let me ask you, how did you find the process?
Quite. It took a while, but it was actually it felt like a transformation overnight. And what was weird is, as I changed my kind of mental narrative, if you like, and kind of worked to intercept, I can't remember who it was in the book Man's Search for Meaning. He talks about in between stimulus and response, there's a space, and that space is your opportunity to choose your how you react to stuff. And so I spend a lot of time kind of trying to identify those internal narratives, and just say, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not gonna listen to that anymore, and I'm going to replace those. I did things like writing my CV, looking at my strengths, and a lot of I tried affirmations. I read a lot of self-help books, all this kind of stuff to rewrite that story. But what was fascinating was, as I rewrote my internal story, the external world actually changed around me. So my physical results got better. So my financial situation improved, because letters would come from the bank and I would be too afraid to open them, because I didn't want to face the reality of what that was going to be like. But I started facing it, started arming myself with the information. Oh, it's bad, but okay, how can I deal with this? Started dealing with it, and my financial situation changed. I started letting go of things, letting go of anger, letting go of kind of frustration, and I became less uptight. And then I started letting go of kind of even dreams and goals and aspirations. And suddenly opportunities came to me. So a lot of the dreams we hold on to are actually holding us back. And so to get rid of those actually opens you up to opportunities. And so I think, by changing my internal story, my external story changed as well. And it was quite astounding. But it got to a point where I was thinking, how far can I take this? Can this turn me into a millionaire? You know what I mean? Can I become an astronaut or something? You know what I mean? It's like we can like take ownership of that internal narrative if we are so inclined. I mean, you have to get to a certain pain point to make it happen.
Absolutely.
But also understanding, these thoughts. Meditation was quite key in there. But it's like that whole idea of these thoughts aren't facts. Where are these thoughts coming from? What is this? Can I turn the volume down on them?
Yeah.
Do they serve me? Is this narrative? And also understanding that a lot of our kind of it's easier to take external thoughts, external stories, than to create our own, which is why it's so easy to become manipulated by the media, for example, or by advertising, that kind of stuff, or the people around you, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, if that is the case, who are we really? If all of this stuff is so malleable, where is the authentic?
Is exactly it. Yeah.
Us,
Yeah.
I mean, is it just a matter of we're somewhere in the middle, or is us all of it, or is it none of it? Do you know what I mean? Are we our best selves? Is that who we really are, or are we, or is that just a kind of another abstract version of the kind of storylessness?
Yeah. Because I think there's a few things in there that you mentioned that's really interesting. But just touching on this last point, amongst all of this, who are we? And I think that's something we all should explore. And it's a bit like, because what you said is so important, because what meditation really is about is you're watching in a really practical, down-to-earth way. If medicine is to kind of study, physiology is to study the body, then meditation is to study yourself, your sense of self. And it's just literally anyone can start doing this right now. You don't need a guided meditation. And weirdly, I think we did this when we were children. It's that whole, and we always start from the outside in, right? When we're kids, we'll kind of look up at the sky. And I know, everyone would have done this when we ask ourselves, well, where did we come from? If the sky is infinite, then what does that really mean in terms of my life here on this earth? When I go to sleep, where do I go? It's kind of these kind of silly questions that we were kind of curious about when we were kids that we just need to kind of ask ourselves again. Like, and what you're saying in terms of really knowing what a thought is just so important, because then you stop paying as much attention to the contents of the thought. Even if you were to just sit down for 30 minutes, I'm just going to sit down and count all the thoughts that I have. That itself, I think, would impart so much wisdom, because you'll see that when you start doing this practice, the kind of multi-layered cleverness of a thought, but also its simplicity. Because what will happen is you'll start asking yourself, well, I don't know what a thought is. Well, that's a thought. Is what I had just now a thought? Well, that's a thought. I'm getting really confused here. That's a thought. And then you start going through it more and more and more. And then you're like, oh, now I'm not having a thought. That's a thought. And if you can go down that rabbit hole, and you can kind of get close to that whole question of, where do thoughts come from? Because that doesn't have an answer. That question does not have an answer, but it's just a way of looking at things. And then when you see exactly like you're saying, the thoughts are thoughts, then the contents of it become far less powerful. And like you're saying in terms of the media, I think you can only be manipulated if you give the contents of your thought value. That's in no way to say that you can have extremely toxic thoughts and you can go out and do whatever you want in the world, because the pain and suffering is still real to some degree, but you kind of need to know where it all fits in. Because the natural inclination is, the closer you get to that sense, again, of what you're saying in terms of who we are, if we are just If we can transfer ourselves to all the characters that we see in films, all the books that we read, all the TV shows that we see, all the games that we play, we are always going, just transferring ourselves constantly. And on the other spectrum, if we were to say that it's only when we have a thought that we feel a sense of self. In other words, if we don't have a thought, we don't exist, we are completely storyless. All of these things point to the question, which is how authentic is our sense of actual self? And that's something that I don't think really, I wouldn't feel right even trying to give that an answer, but that's something we need to explore. And just the act of exploring that question is meditation in itself. And you don't need to have an answer for that, but it just helps you, again, going back to what you're saying about, I think, Viktor Frankl, about that gap between thought and action. All that is there's a gap, that storyless gap that happens in between, because the less the gap is, the more likely you're going to act on it. But actually, that observing self that is entirely storyless to some degree, and I apologize if this sounds abstract, but that kind of storyless part of you, as that kind of grows, and that really another word to use for it is just awareness. You're aware, you're watching, you're seeing. Once that grows, then you'll see that certain habits that you have is just a kind of a default mechanism that you have, that you're just acting out. You don't have to feel terrible and suffer through it. You can just see, well, this is just a dependence that I have, and you can start adjusting towards that. You can start making decisions that are more mindful, that are more kind of aware. And at the same time, I also want to put the kind of disclaimer. I don't want people to think, I don't want someone who's listening to this to think that you shouldn't go out and push. Because I think in a lot of the mindfulness circles, it's like, be compassionate to yourself, show love to yourself. Sometimes you need to push to get to that space. Sometimes you need to go through that pain to get to that space. Sometimes you need to go and run until you feel like you cracked a bone in your leg. Sometimes, people need to say, oh, the reason he's running so much is because there's some issues he's going through. It doesn't matter. Sometimes people have to go through that. They have to push hard to get to that space where they can be more settled and kind of start exploring a lot of these questions. At the end of the day, I guess what I'm saying is there's no one answer for everyone. Just because someone is pushing through it doesn't mean that they're not trying to be more mindful and trying to be more aware.
I think that's a topic for another conversation, this whole kind of human dependence on finding answers for things, where actually, the whole of life is a koan. It's an unanswerable question. But the whole point is to explore the question. You don't need to find an answer, but just explore it.
Exactly.
I was having it was a few months ago. I sleep pretty well these days because I'm normally pretty tired. I get up very early with my little girl. I have a terrible back that keeps me awake most,
right.
keeps me tossing and turning. So I don't struggle to get to sleep. But a few months ago, I was having one of those nights where your mind is just racing and racing and racing. And I don't know if it was because I had too much caffeine or what it was, but it was just going from one thing to another. And it was, I can't remember how I got there, but I started thinking about the Pope. And then that led me on to...
You started to think about what, sorry?
The Pope.
Right.
So,
okay.
Who lives in the Vatican. my mind was just going from one thing to another. Right. And then I started thinking about Jude Law, because he'd played the Pope in a TV series. I'd never seen it, but I saw him interviewed about it. And then it went on to some other film that he'd been in, and then it just went on this kind of random, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon type, just jumping around. And I was like, I can't sleep. Why can't I sleep? And then as I kind of realized how absurd this kind of train of thoughts was, I kind of got to the point where I thought, this is ridiculous. What am I going to think of next? And then suddenly I found myself not being in those thoughts, but I was outside of them. And it was a little bit like you were talking about counting your thoughts. And I was like, okay, so I'm going to sit back, almost like I'm watching a film here, and just see where my mind goes next. And before long, I'd fallen asleep,
right?
Because I'd come out of that, I detached myself from that kind of thought process.
Because you start looking for the thoughts, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and
right,
but becoming witness to them, which I guess is what meditation is all about.
Yeah.
And I don't really where I'm going with that, but it's just I suppose it's, again, not letting that kind of narrative, that internal narrative, dictate things, do the driving, if you like.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. But
but
that's so interesting because it's that whole story of thoughts is strange because the moment you start looking for them, it disappears.
yeah,
It's a bit like it's a bit like fear. The moment you look directly at it, it isn't there anymore. You might feel that anxiety in your body, that fear kind of subsides. And it's really interesting what you're saying about when you started thinking of the absurdity of all the different chains of thoughts you're having, you're like, you're going to start looking at what's going to come next, and then you fell asleep.
yeah, yeah, completely.
That's really interesting.
But I mean, it reminds me, a kind of thing I often bring up in the podcast is this whole RAIN practice. I don't know if you know it, but it's quite a common practice. If you're feeling something that you're uncomfortable with, like, you know, you're fed up with something, you're angry about something, and it's about recognize that feeling, allow it to, you know, rather than fighting against it. You know, I recognize I'm angry. I'm going to be angry. That's fine. I'm going to allow it. But then I'm going to investigate it. And I'm going to say, why am I angry? What is this telling me about myself? And then I'm going to nurture that. I'm going to say, it's okay. It's fine to be angry. And by the time you get to N, you know, you've gone through RAIN. By the time you get to N, half the time you're not feeling angry anymore because you've gone through this journey, and that you've taken the edge off it. And it just reminded me of what you were saying about fear. You know, when you know, it's like Freddy Krueger, when you turn to face him and say, I don't believe in you anymore, he disappears. You've taken his power away. And
absolutely.
It's a powerful thing. I mean,
so it's RAIN. Is that an acronym?
Yeah, it's an acronym. So it's you recognize, you allow, you investigate, and then you nurture.
Okay, that's beautiful.
Yeah, so it's used quite commonly in all kinds of kind of mindfulness. I think they do it in acceptance and commitment therapy and things
exactly
like that.
Right. So it's it reminds me a lot of the kind of acceptance meditation, which I think is fundamental, and because in a lot of ways you're kind of getting in tune with that sense of awareness, because we are aware of everything. There's nothing awareness isn't going to say no to anything. And personally, I think watching a video of Rupert Spira, I think he did a meditation on acceptance, which I think is probably one of the most best articulated guided meditation about acceptance. And this whole sense of, in some ways, sitting down with whatever feeling you have and getting to know it, and getting to be friends with it. It's really beautiful. And what you're saying about RAIN reminds me a lot of that, and I completely agree with you. It is fundamental, and we can do this with pretty much anything, actually, positive and negative thoughts, and we should do it with both things we like and things we don't like. We should sit with them for a bit and find out what they're actually made of, and who they really are. Even if you're feeling really elated about something, maybe something worked out for you, and I've been in the same situation, and then it's like, well, sit down with it and see, what does that actually mean? What's that excitement that you're feeling? But yeah, no, it's definitely, I agree. I think it's very important.
There's I had a conversation with a woman called Martha Beck, who is in America, she's known as America's best known life coach. Although she's much more than that, I think. She talks a lot about kind of exploring these states of profound, I mean, you call those kind of storyless moments where you have that sunset and suddenly you're not kind of trying to, you know, there's no cognitive process involved. You're just like, wow, okay, this is a very raw experience I'm having here. And she talks about wordlessness, and, you know, that basically when you're born without language. And so everything is a pure experience one way or another. It's emotional, or it's visual, or it's, you know, you've got your senses, but there's no language attached to that. You know, a tree is not a tree. It's a million different things. It's the way it moves. It's the color of the leaves. It's, you know, it's life cycle. But as soon as we start to learn language, we kind of put up a barrier between our kind of experiential selves, if you like, and our, you know, our human selves, our selves in society, in the kind of human world. And you touched on it with that kind of talking about the sunset. There's that profound moment, And maybe that's what mindfulness is trying to be about. Everything is striving, everything is labels, everything is stories. But in those moments where we feel the ground beneath our feet, or we, recognize the love between us and, our fellow man, whatever it might be, or, that sunset, or the fear, or whatever it is, that profound moment is where, I mean, is it too bold to say that's where life is happening right now?
I think that's where life is happening also. And I think the problem, because you're saying something really beautiful and I'm talking about a problem, but I think the problem is that we've only had the side of the words. Yeah. Because it's, again, I think that's the growth that society is going through, because we have lived in a way that we had to behave in a very mechanized way because of the kind of jobs we did, because the kind of society was always engineered towards our kind of profession, to the point like our surnames used to imply, at least in the West, the kind of profession that you had. So a lot of the family names are rooted in their profession. And because of that, the kind of system the system of work, if you will, meant that we had to be grounded on our words, and we had to be grounded in processes, and we had to as part of that, we had to give up another aspect of life. And that's what mindfulness is really. Mindfulness is just one of the things. You can have zero interest in mindfulness and you can still be perfectly in tune with that other wordless, storyless, beautiful part of our life. It's, as an example, like dancers go through it. And the weird thing is, like, human beings have a way of finding this out, right? Even if mindfulness didn't exist, even a long time ago, we had ways of finding this out, which is to go for a walk, which might be to dance, which might be to have festivals and dancing around something. And even being surrounded by people and singing in unison will kind of get you to that similar space where there are no words, where there are no stories, where you just feel at peace, and we'll go after it. I mean, even, like growing up, what did we do? Like we'd go with our mates, like get pissed and go to a club and dance. It's like, yeah, sure, it was to meet girls, but at the same time, you dance, man. Like you really are in the moment when you dance. Even if you're utterly shit-faced, you can still kind of appreciate that silence to some degree. And I think we are just getting more focused about it. And I think we are growing into it a bit more, this kind of space that's been there accidentally, that we've always kind of gravitated towards. And I think it's being brought out a bit more now than it was before, which I think it's really important. And mindfulness, meditation, all of these things is kind of pointing us back towards that. And a lot of the stories that we see even now in films and everything is kind of touching on that sense of that silence, that beauty. And because what does it really mean to be in that space? Because in that space, what it really means is to not be judgmental. Because that is that space. When you're dancing and when you're having a great time, are you judging stuff? No. The moment you're judging yourself, where you're like, oh shit, I look a bit funny, you're not in that moment anymore. You're not in that space, because in that kind of storyless state, you're utterly judgmentless, and a lot of the stories that we see now is about that kind of openness, to people, openness to cultures, openness to the way we think. It's a lot less closed off, and it's a lot more open-minded. And I think that's the growth that's really happening now, that is exciting. Obviously, on this other side, there's still lots of things that needs to be improved, but I think we are kind of on the right trajectory.
Yeah, I've heard,
as a society, at least.
I've heard. Well, I mean, I think there are two sides to that. I think on the one side, there's someone called it an extinction burst. You get this kind of, I think that comes from kind of astrophysics. When a star collapses, you get this massive burst of energy before it finally dies. But there's this kind of extinction burst of capitalism, or not necessarily capitalism, but all the things that are bad about capitalism. There's a big force pushing for better, because our survival depends on it as a race, and there's a big force pushing for kind of mental well-being, because we're aware that a lot of our societal cultural practices are actually quite harmful to us. 9 to 5, Monday to Friday isn't written in the stars. It's not it's a man-made concept that isn't necessarily aligned with our evolutionary nature, and so on the one hand, you've got this kind of, it might manifest as anti-wokeism, or it might manifest as this kind of pushback against progressive liberal ideas, if you like. And people are calling it an extinction burst. It's the last kind of final gasp of all this kind of all the bad traits, like when you're trying to drink a green smoothie and someone says, "What's that filth you're drinking? Have a burger instead." You know what I mean? And it's like, oh, that burger is tempting, but no, I'm going to stick to the
right. Yeah. Is that kind of last fight? That's what you mean?
Exactly. And but hopefully that it's going to die down then, and there will be a kind of, I don't know whether it's going to be a rebirth or just a gradual move towards a healthier way of being in alignment with who we are, our nature, and the way nature is. There's that kind of thing. I mean, trying to loosely bring it back to this notion of stories.
Yeah,
we need stories. We need to have a story. I mean, if we are completely storyless all the time, we become unemotional and cold, and we just go through life, and doesn't matter what happens because we're without stories. But we need that story to hold on to, because we are spiritual beings having a human experience, if you like.
Yeah.
But I guess it's, do we own the story, or is it being used against us? Is it being commoditized by someone else? Is it becoming a stick that we're beating ourselves with, or is it becoming something that we're, is my story, I can be better, and I want to be this better version of myself, and what does that even look like, or am I comfortable?
It's like healthy stories.
Yeah. I mean, how do we
I think that's what it is. I think that's where it needs to, I think that's where we are going to some degree, because again, I think on the other spectrum, because again, I'm terrible with names. I can't remember any of these quotes, but the truth of it was really that two of the worst things that can happen to you is to not get what you want, or to get what you want. Yeah. I didn't say this. This is a quote from someone else. I can't remember who. And I think that's fundamentally where we are at right now, because I think we're transitioning to the second pain, which is to get what we want. And even, this whole idea of liberal and conservative, the left and right, the way I see it is that it's really difficult at times. I'm saying the way I try to see it is that this is the natural progression of our growth. And there's no point hating on the farmers because they think a certain way, because actually they were part of that growth just as much as for them to not be so angry at the young people now who they think is woke. Well, actually, that's a natural part of growth neither. I mean, we are unified in that we are all growing. But coming back to a very important point that you raised, which is about the stories that we tell ourselves, I think the way, even for me, I need to improve a lot of the stories that I tell myself. Like today I pulled nearly a 12-hour day, and I was feeling pretty exhausted at the end of it. And I'm trying to kind of build something by myself that I know is extremely difficult. And I find myself at certain points kind of going down that judgment route. And it's only natural because I'm human. But I think what I focus on is that kind of trying to keep in the same context of what we were talking about in terms of storyless. I think our stories will only improve in quality if we are more in tune with the storyless side of ourselves. And I think the judgments that I have about myself and the stories that I have about myself compared to years back, I think the quality I would like to think at least, that the quality has somewhat changed. And I've seen this in other people as well. It's like, and it doesn't have to be with mindfulness or exercises, people who go through kind of transformatory kind of things in their life where they've had to do something very difficult, or they've seen something very sad, where they've seen the meaning of suffering, and they suddenly kind of, the base just drops and they go much lower into that space, that storyless space, and they become more in tune with that storyless side of themselves. and then you just see them flourish, like they come out of it, and like it's not like, you know, they wake up the next morning and everything is rosy and peachy and there's some sort of like superhumans. No, but there's a certain quality about them that's changed. And I think then the stories start to become a bit more healthier if we are in tune with that kind of storyless, wordless side of ourselves. Basically what I'm saying is awareness. And actually, another thing that you said, which is really interesting, was with that life coach that you mentioned. Sorry, I forgot her name.
Yeah.
Right. And she was talking about being a child and how children see, how babies see the world and how adults see the world. Because one of the things that I've started doing recently is kind of trying to, because the problem with meditation is it's in some ways, it's quite selfish, because you're constantly looking in yourself and it's all about you and your practice. But one thing is when you try to project the attention outwards and you try to watch the world around you regularly and constantly, and you come out of the practice, and this is something that you practice outside on a normal day as much as you can. And then what you realize is that actually it is just objects that are around you and the sounds that are happening around you. And it's exactly like you were saying, we start putting meanings around it. And it's actually, I think we're using a different part of our brain, which we need to do tasks and do things and communicate with people. But we need to, at the same time, be connected to that part of our brain, if you know, think of it more practically, that is connected to the word less, that is connected more to the kind of present state, which in the truest form doesn't have any words. So we need to have a balance between those two sides of our brain. And then I think we'll live a more healthier, a more compassionate existence, where we all can grow together without as much of the violence that we've had to go through as human beings. But again, that violence is just possibly part of our growth.
Because I was going to ask you about, what does it mean to get into a storyless state? What does that mean? Because surely every time you talk about people who've discovered their kind of their storylessness, if that's a thing.
Yeah.
You said they flourish. So how do we recognize that storyless part of us? But then you kind of answered the question for me. You said it's basically awareness, isn't it? It's a kind of a objective awareness of ourselves. And maybe it was a little bit like when I decided I didn't want to be that guy anymore. I was like suddenly brought into that storyless state, or that kind of objective self-awareness of like, whoa, hang on a minute. I'm not fun to be around. I'm a drain. You get radiators and drains, I'm a drain. And I was kind of jolted into that. And that's the kind of thing. How do we nurture awareness? How do we nurture kind of, a kind of objective self-awareness without it? Because, you say every time you think of something, you can't not have a thought. It's very difficult to not have a thought unless you are completely, zenning out to a sunset and just like,
or a psychopath,
yeah, something like that. So how can we be objective in terms of our own self-awareness? Is that even possible?
See, I think it's such an important question that you're asking, because this is something that I have asked myself many times, and the kind of answer that I settled on years back was, I already know what it is. And meditation is just one of the ways that I do it. But, and the really weird thing is if you look at people around you, especially people who are very close to you, you find them seeking out the same kind of awareness as well. It can be through exactly like you're saying, it can be through kind of that, when you see yourself, when you see the stories that you tell yourself and you suddenly decide that you want to change. So that kind of awareness of these different stories that you tell yourself. Or it could just be that you like to go and dance all the time. Or it could just be that you like to go for really long walks every day. Or it could just be that you like to spend every evening writing stories. Because actually in all of those things, I think what you're asking is to intentionally do it, to intentionally tap into that awareness. And I think to intentionally do it is something that I am still figuring out, because I'm not convinced you can intentionally do it. It's again that kind of, it can influence you. You can try as much as you want to influence it, but I'm not sure how much success you'll get at. In some ways, meditation is a very close way of doing it, because you're really getting in tune with that awareness. But I would just say that meditation doesn't have to be you sitting with the timer for 30 minutes. That's great. And I think that should be part of what you're doing. But you can try the same thing with kind of your curiosity of finding out, exactly like we're talking about before, in terms of, where do these thoughts come from? What is this? Let me watch myself having thoughts for 30 minutes. Or it might be that you go for a walk and you just tell yourself, you know what, I'm just going to watch with my eyes everything that's around me. And the moment you get lost in thought, find something else to look at and just keep looking for 30 minutes. And in a lot of ways, I think, kind of circling back to what I said at the start, I think to answer your question to some degree, I guess what I'm saying is you need to follow your own curiosity about yourself, because actually what you discovered for yourself is very true for you. And like that, I think we all have our little techniques that we have, or questions that we've been curious about, that we just need to keep going into and discovering for ourselves, but get really curious about that question of, who is having these thoughts? Who is actually suffering? Why am I so judgmental? Why do I think I'm this way? Why am I so affected by this film? Why am I so afraid of this film that I'm watching, even though I know it isn't real? What part of me is afraid? And kind of leading down those questions. And I think you'll get to that kind of storyless state or awareness, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, it is a powerful tool. I mean, you talk about, we kind of transport our internal narratives or our sense of identity into the film or into the game.
Right.
And I know, like, sports coaches will tell people to visualize themselves winning a race, and the body, running and winning, and the body, allegedly, I don't know how true this is or whether it's just one of those kind of urban myths, but the body responds in exactly the same way as if you were actually running the race, so a kind of mental imagining of the race is just as powerful as going out there and running it itself, because there's no kind of differentiation up here inside your brain.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways you can go with this, but yeah, that sense of awareness that Martha Beck talked about, becoming aware of what you're aware of. Right. Because basically what our brains are pattern recognition kind of filters, and depending on our state of mind, how we're feeling, what mood we're in, we pick up on different things. If we're in a victim mentality, we'll pick up on all the things that will reinforce that. If we're winners, we'll pick up on all, if we think we're winners, we'll pick up on all the things that will reinforce that. You could have had everyone could hate you, but you'll pick up on the one person who thinks you're great. Whereas,
right.
A different person would pick up on all the other people.
Yeah.
But I guess it's becoming aware of what we're becoming aware of, just saying, I've noticed that today, and I've noticed this, and I'm just picking up on all of these things. What is that telling me about myself? And,
exactly. And I think one of the things you said there is so important, because this whole, like you're talking about the two mentalities becoming, transitioning from the victim mentality to the kind of winner mentality. What is really shitty about that, and what really sucks about that, is most of us think in the way that we've been brought up. And that I would say, and this is me being judgmental, and that is extremely unfair, because the experiences that you had when you're growing up, the thinking processes that you were surrounded by when you were growing up, defines to a large extent how you're going to think when you are grown up. And which is, again, I think it comes back to what we were talking about, and in some ways ties in with being aware of being aware. But more so what we were talking about before, in terms of the stories that we tell ourselves, and how to and why it's so important to get in tune with that awareness, or that storyless state, or understanding where these thoughts are coming from, because you're not at fault for the way you're thinking, right? It's like, you need to do the work to think in a more healthier way, just so you can be happy. But at the same time, it can be very difficult if you don't know that the thoughts you're having, the suffering you're going through. It's actually the pain and the suffering of the people around you that you're going through. And that's extremely important, because on a very practical level, because it's really simple, in the mindfulness sphere to say, don't judge and don't do all these things. But you need to really have an awareness of the pain and the suffering that actually you're not responsible for. And it's purely, you didn't choose to grow up in the environment that you grew up in. But tools like mindfulness, or finding things you love in life, getting in tune with that awareness, asking the questions, being curious about who you are, will kind of, I think, help you adjust to those stories. And maybe even, exactly like you're saying, the kind of experience that you went through, kind of reach a point where you can switch out of them and kind of pick the stories that are better suited and basically just bring you more happiness in your life.
That's maybe we should think about wrapping it up now, so I won't, because I mean, I feel like we could go on for another day or two talking about these kind of things, but that's really, like you say, we're not kind of responsible for these stories, but I think we have to take responsibility for them, and that's, otherwise the cycle will repeat and it will keep repeating. And I think I've had this conversation a few times with there's a woman called Donna Lancaster who does amazing work with anger and things like that, and she's been on the podcast as well. But I've noticed it when a big transformative moment for me was becoming a father. And as my little girl has grown up, I write a column for a parenting magazine, which is a kind of alternative parenting, if you like, but mindful parenting magazine. And I'm a first-time dad. I don't have a clue what I'm doing, but one thing I've noticed, and I've seen written elsewhere, and I've noticed from my own experience, is that children don't do what you say; they do what you do. They do all the things that you unconsciously do. So you can kind of be, setting a good example. But if you're filled with anxiety, filled with self-doubt, filled with all of these kind of negative things that we actually attach some kind of pride to, in a way, it's almost like being confident and being happy almost feels like we're not really connected with what's really going on, or it feels smug or wrong somehow to be confident and happy. But I want my child to be growing up confident and happy. And if I really want that, then I have to try and be confident and happy myself, and it's so easy to, in our humility and in that kind of story of I'm a worthy person, and worthy people are filled with doubt, and they're filled with kind of anxiety and shame and all of this kind of thing, because they are worthy, humble people. And actually, I don't want my little girl to be filled with all of those things. I want her to be strong and assertive and happy, and filled with compassion and empathy as well. But then I realized, actually, I deserve those things anyway. When I was born into this world, I shouldn't have to earn this place. I shouldn't have to earn my happiness. I owe it to myself to be confident and to be happy. And I shouldn't feel ashamed of it, even though I go through periods when I do feel like I'm kind of winning in the happiness stakes and the confidence stakes. And then I become aware of that, and I kind of suddenly feel ashamed about that, and it knocks me back. It's like a kind of swinging pendulum. But in a way, we deserve to take ownership of our story and rewrite it in the best way possible. I think
absolutely,
because life is hard, right? So I think we need to. We owe it to
absolutely
ourselves.
And I think exactly, and I think it's a very beautiful point to end this on, which is we need to in some ways take ownership of the stories that we have, and we are responsible for our happiness, but we are not at fault for all the shitty things that might have happened to us, and all the answers are there, and we can find it for ourselves.
Absolutely brilliant. Okay, well, in that case, we will bring it to an end there. If people want to find out about Plane, or you're working on Inward at the moment, but it's not quite ready yet.
I mean,
where can they go?
If you Google meditation game, Plane is the first link, and from there you'll be able to find Inward as well.
Okay, brilliant. And it's Playne, isn't it?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Well,
Thank
Krish,
you so much for having me. It was great to talk to you, Chris.
I know, yeah. There's so many different directions we can go in, and yeah, we should revisit this again in a few more months and do it again. But yeah, thanks ever so much for that. I really
thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk to you, Chris.
There you go, a great conversation with Krish there, and it just goes to show how powerful our stories are. Yet we seem to kind of put ownership of these stories to the outside world, to things that have happened to us, things that people say to us, when in fact when we can take ownership of those stories and see what they do to us and detach ourselves from them and take control of rewriting them, we can actually use them to take ownership of our lives and create an existence much more aligned with who we are and who we came here to be. So thank you to Krish for that. If you want to find out more about his work, then head over to plane.co. That's PLAYNE.co, and you can find out about the Plane, the meditation game, and also the new game Inward, which is coming soon. Next week, we'll be talking to Charles Clay about going from a consumer mindset to a producer mindset, which is very powerful, focusing on abundance rather than lack, which I think is a very interesting conversation. And he's a very dynamic guy, so don't miss that one. If you don't want to miss any of the episodes, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcast. You can also give us a rating and a review. That'd be really nice if you can. And if you want to carry on the conversation, join the Facebook group. Just search for Conversations on Living. I've also got a newsletter which I send out very infrequently, but it'd be great if you could sign up. And if you do, you'll get a free copy of my most recent book, Shine Manifesto. Just head over to conversationsonliving.com. You can find my meditations there as well, my essays, and all the episodes of this podcast. And please spread the love, because this is the way we kind of get exposure. So tell your friends and, help us to reach as many people with these kind of empowering ideas as possible. And that's it for this week. But thank you so much for tuning in and for listening and making it this far. And in the meantime, have a lovely day.